All right, so where we left off was getting ready to set up the Django admin. I kind of talked about that in the first video. The admin portion of this is where you can add clients or staff to your individual project. They can add, change, delete content. You can add things to your database, and it's significantly easier to do that through the admin interface than have to sit there and script everything out or type it into the console portion. It's not intended for use by your site visitors, right? The admin side is just for you to be on the back side of things. You would build out a interface that would be their admin. So like their profile page and stuff like that. If you have profiles set up for your project, that would all be separate than the Django admin part. So to use Django admin, we need to first create a super user. So in the terminal, you would just go Python manage.py, create super user, right? And we give it a name. We can, hit enter, and it would use JSON because it's using the default of my operating system's username. It's the only reason it shows up there. Otherwise, you can set it. So we're going to set it to admin. You can go ahead and set an email address in there. We're just going to say jlzeller@fhsu.edu, and then a password. For now, I'm going to make it simple, just password. And of course, it's too common, and I'm going to bypass my validation. Obviously, you don't want to set your password to password. Please don't do that. But for the purposes of this project, I'm going to show that. If you make it long and complicated, then it will go ahead and pass password validation, and then you can go ahead and hit yes and go through. Anybody got any questions on that? It's pretty basic. If you ever forget the user password, you should hopefully still have console access to your project. You can come in and overwrite that create user. So you can do a new create user and set up a new admin and do all that. So if we go to our website, of course, nothing's going to show up because we don't have an index yet, right? Remember, we do have a polls, and our polls is working just fine. And we have an admin in here as well. And so in this admin, we can now use our admin login. In my case, I set it to password. And you have this nice Django login. Ignore the Chrome telling you not to use a password, right? And so this is the basic look of what an admin will look like. So remember that we have users and we have groups. This is basic authentication built into Django. So if I click on users, I can then add a user in here, and I can say something like jlzeller, and I'll set another password. And I can say that, oops, what did I do? Password was too common. Password validation again, right? Okay, we can hit save. Yeah, it doesn't like any combination of password either. There we go. Okay, so we passed password validation. We can see the algorithm and all the hashes on that. When we come out here on this side, you can see that we can set different user permissions. So we can allow them to adjust, add, do whatever we want. If you notice down here in the polls section, this gives us access to the database. So the user can either view, delete, change, or add those different objects that we set up. So we had choices and we had questions. We can also adjust sessions, that kind of stuff if we need to clear that. So our typical user won't have anything like those type of permissions. We can also give them permissions as either super users, or we can give them permissions as staff. The default for staff, if we go over here to groups, you can add a group, and we could do something like, say, my admins or something. Then we can set up these different permissions, and then you just assign that user to that group. So if you have a bunch of them to do, it's best not to set it on the individual user, set up groups, and then assign that user to a specific group. Pretty basic setting up there as an admin. You can either view the site, and it will take you out to the link so you can see what it actually looks like. You can change your password, which will allow you to change your admin stuff, and then of course log out. Pretty basic admin. But all of this is customizable, and you can add all sorts of stuff. So right now, we can give ourselves permissions to add things to like polls and question, but we don't have a way of doing it in here. So we need to add things to this Django admin in order to be able to edit those particular database entries. Right? So to do that, and you'll see things like date, time fields and all sorts of things that you can add things in there. In our case, we need to be able to edit something so that we can modify it. So if we go back to our polls, which is here, and we want to go into our admin page, you'll notice by default, nothing's being registered in the models. In these models, we have to register to say, hey, we want to be able to edit this in our admin. So we have our admin imported. We just need a from, I can type, from dot models. Remember, this is pulling back from our models pie. And we have our question and we have our choice in here, right? We can see that I committed that. All right, so from dot models, import question. And down at the very bottom, we're going to do a admin.site.register question. Okay. So this will import that model in. This will allow us to show it on the website itself. So you have to have both parts of this inside of here. Now we can actually edit how we want that to be displayed, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But for now, this is how we can go ahead and save it. You'll notice down below here, it should have restarted our website, and it did. Come back out here to our admin. We're going to go full page with that and click on our Django admin. Notice how polls popped up automatically down here. So the style, the structure, all that's built into the Django admin. We can now click on questions, and you'll see that we have one question object. This is the what is up that we created. It has that date timestamp because those are the two fields that we had in there. If there was multiple changes in that, we could click on history and we could see any kind of change history that was in there. So it's really slick to see users, change history, all that stuff's built right into the Django admin. You don't have to code that for your app. Makes things much faster to scale out. All right. What they're going to have you do is you can see those change dates and chart fields. So you can go in here, you can modify those different fields. You can change your time zone, etc. All that will show up there. Now, there's a couple different things that we can tweak in that, and I don't think we're going to do that right away. We're not until we get up and running. But we can tweak, like, if we want to have questions in here, we might also want our choices, right? So we can modify our choices in here, and we can also put them inline so that every time we prompt a new question, it asks for 4 different choices inside. We can design the admin to automatically create that when we do a question. And those are all inline forms, which we'll learn about here shortly. So there's a couple more views in this project that they want to create. So for example, in the view side of it, we want to create some details so that we can figure out which question we're looking at, the results of all the different questions that we prompted, and then an actual section to go ahead and see the votes. So we go back out to our views, and this is under our index here, and we're going to have our def detail request. Question ID. And so in this request, not only do we remember that the request is when we actually pull a website, we're getting our request, which has all of our request headers and our client information, all that stuff. And then we also are passing in a given question ID so that we can look that up in the database. So if we do a return HTTP response, it says you're looking at question %S. And so we're just doing simple substitution here. ID. Okay. Let's see, we need 2 spaces here. There we go.
There's just a spelling at question ID.
Yeah. What'd you have, Sam?
There's just a spelling at question ID.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you, sir. There we go. Gotcha. Okay. So we get our results in, and this time I'm just going to save some typing and copy and paste it in. And that's not alien farms. Let's try that again. Okay. And we just need to throw 1 more space in. That's also PEP compliance, and so we should be good. Now, with those different views, remember that views are referring to pages, right? So right now, we're just responding with an HTTP response. We're not using any templates or anything like that just yet. But these are defining the different pages that we can go to. So if we go to /detail, we would get detail popping up. If we go to results, we would get results, vote, etc. In order to actually set up that, we have to go to our URLs. So we want the URLs that are specifically in our polls app. And we need to define those in this list of URL patterns. So the first one up here at the top is going to be our index that we already had. And now we're going to set up paths for our individual ones inside of here. So if we copy just what they have, so we don't have to retype it here. And they did the smart thing and used comments so that you could remember exactly where they're going, right? So this one up here was one that we already had in here. This one, notice that we're setting up our int question ID. So we're taking in our question ID as an integer, and we're going to be able to plug that in. So if we say we are on question 5, it's now going to reflect question 5 inside our content, right? These are building dynamic URLs at this point. So this is in part 3. Should have tutorial part 3. If you, okay. Yes, yes. Yep, no problem. Okay. So when we look at this, what this is end up building is this is going to build dynamic URLs depending on what question that we end up passing in or what question that we're coming in from. We can see that that's going back to our views and it's pointing to those particular functions that we created. So detail is going to detail, results to results, vote to vote. Again, you want to kind of keep these similar so that you remember what you're typing in there, right? So these views are going to map out to these, in this case, just giving us simple HTTP responses. All right. Now we're going to actually write one that does something other than just do a response, right? So if we come in here and we go back to our website, and we go to /polls, you remember that we get our index page. And if we say we're on question 1, you'll say it's looking at question 1, right? And if we go to detail, it's going to get us details on question 1, which we don't have set up yet. But if we had results, you would say you're looking at the results of question 1. The last one we had was vote. And you'll see we're getting vote. Probably misspelled detail that first time. Nope, it's just not matching it yet. And if you remember, that's because there is no /detail. The detail is actually referring to this URL. Everybody get that? Because of the way we set up that URL right here. So notice results and vote, you actually have to type that in after that /. The one that doesn't have anything is called detail. I stress that because it's easy to get lost in all your URL patterns that are inside of there. Been there, done that. Okay, so now we're going to do something more fancy than just straight HTTP responses. So if we go back to our views, and up at the top, we have our HTTP response. We need to import our models. So from .models, import our question. And then down in our index and saying, hello world, you're at the polls index, we're going to modify that a little bit. Actually, I'm going to give us another line here. Okay. Instead, we are going to say our latest question underscore list. And we're going to call our question .objects .order by. I'll explain this here in just a second. And we're going to order by our negative pub date. And we're going to slice that to 5. So what does that line actually mean? This, if you recall, when we were using the command line, is going to do a request from the database and get back all the question objects at once, right? And if we said return all, it would return all of them. In this case, we specifically want to order in a descending by publication date, right? Not only that, does anybody remember what the slice does here? Yes, it grabs basically the first 5 results, right? Roughly, because you have 0 all the way through that one. Through 4, which would give you 5 total results. So this is how we can basically get the top 5 questions, or the last 5 questions in this case, filtered out of the database. Anybody have any questions on that? And in this case, it should just pull 1 question, right? That's all we currently have in there. All right, next line is our output. And here we're going to use one of our join commands that we did back in Python 360. From join, we want to pass in our list. Remember, this comes back as a list, right? When we look for objects out of the database, we always get a list of those objects back. So what we want to do is take our join, and we're going to say our question.text. So we're going to take the question text out of each object and say for Q in latest question list. Pull that back. And for each one of those, we want to return our HTTP response of the output that comes in. So let's take a look at what that actually does. And it's my question right again. Struggling with that word. All right. So this is a little more advanced Python than what we did in 360. What this portion is it's looping through all of our latest question lists that came back. We're going to take the question text out of it, and we're going to join it to this new, it's basically a comma separated value, right? We're creating comma separated value by the different question text that's in there. Once we build out this result, which is basically just a long string, we are going to then return that out to the user so they can see that long string. All right. Once we did that, we also have our templates directory. Notice that we have a templates that's on the outside here. You can also have a template specifically for your polls. So we need to create our templates inside of our polls app. Remember that when we do it inside like that, we are building templates that are only for that app, right? And remember that this polls app, I should be able to take that project out, move it into, say, Lori's project, and it would actually work. These apps are not specific to the overall project per se. May not make much sense to have a polls in her whatever app, but that's what the purpose of this is to be able to export it into that. All right. If we look at this one here, and we need to create a index page, right? So inside of this, we have polls, we have templates, and then inside this templates, we create another folder called polls. Yes, it looks a little redundant, but it's how it imports based on being a module within Django. So inside this polls directory, we want to go ahead and create an HTML file. And so if we come down here and say HTML instead of just file, we can say that we want our index file. And that's going to go ahead and give us this nice handy doc type up here at the top, get everything kind of set up. In this case, we don't need to have anything super fancy in here. We're going to copy and paste this into this template. And if you remember, this is basically Python within our HTML code. So what we have is we are passing in our latest question list. If you guys remember, that should be passing in a list. And once we get that in, we're going to set this up in an unordered list, right? And then we go loop through each one of those questions, and we're going to create an aref. In other words, we're going to create a link, hyperlink, based on the question ID that we passed in this list. So we are dynamically building all of our HTML. We don't hand code it and then shove each one inside of there. We're going to build our URL based on polls and whatever question ID, and we're going to just present the question text inside that aref, or that A tag and that href. Once we get done through the list, we do a UL. If we have else, that means that there's no results inside of latest question lists, in which case we just print no polls are currently available. You'll always have to remember to do your indef tag. That's the only caveat to using templates, is that you have to have an indef. All right. Now this, as you know, is like not got all the HTML code, right? We just ripped it out. You should be putting this inside the body tag and all that kind of stuff. This tutorial's ignoring it. It's okay. It's still going to build correct HTML. In your real projects, you would just copy and paste that in. So if we actually didn't do this, we went back to this H tag, and then say we come back here and copy this part in, we would copy this part into this body section. That's all we got to do. Now we have a more complete file in here. On this title, we could just call this our polls, and then we're going to have a little bit more complete all the way through. All right. Once we have that in there, then we want to go ahead and go to our views. And actually, we should be able to save that. So now that that's up and running, let's go ahead and pull our page up. We go to /polls, not pools, polls. And we get the first result that came back, which is what is up. Now, if we had multiple inside of our database, it would show us multiple. So to test that, we can simply go back here to our Django admin, go to add on a question, and we could say, what is your favorite teacher? And we could set today's date and now's time, save that. We could add another one for question text. What is your favorite color? And so now we have at least 3 questions. We come back here and refresh, and you'll see they're all comma separated out. Pretty simple, right? All right. Couple different changes that we're going to make to that. Get back to where I was here. Yeah. Yes. Yep, just like this here. Yep, so if in this case, we should be getting a list back of all those, right? That's what we built with our output. If that's the case, then you can do for loops. There again, you have to make sure you end your for loop. That's the caveat, is everybody forgets this last little tag, and it will tell you that it's broken. But yeah, so there, we don't have to build every list item in there. It just pops it up. Now, the only difference is here, notice how we got comma separated values out here. That's because the way our view is written over here is just to return that with an HTTP response, right? If we want to actually take advantage of this index, we have to change our view to say, hey, render this with the index HTML file. So to change that code, we look at our index, and we're going to steal this piece of code here. So instead of building out a comma separated value and actually posting it, we're going to take our template, and we need to get our loader function up here at the top. So if we come up here before our models and we say from Django.template, import loader. And what that's going to do is basically load that HTML file. It's just a helper function to do that. We tell it what template we want to go get using the get template. And then down here in context, there's always 2 contexts. So in this case, inside of our file, we're saying latest question list equals latest question list. We're basically passing it a dictionary, right? We could have anywhere in our template. So in our template, we're calling this latest question list. If I called this JSON for whatever reason, then over here in my views, I would say that JSON is equal to our latest question list. So as long as you have a template, it doesn't have to match word for word if you're passing in different text every single time. Pull that back so it doesn't have a connection to it. There we go. Last response here is now we're going to actually render this template with our given context, which is basically any data we're passing into our template, and we have to pass in our request that we originally got. All right. That render is going to be really nice and handy for us to pull that in. There's a shortcut to having to write all of this different stuff inside of there, and that's to use the render function that is built into Django. So back up here in shortcuts, you'll see render is already imported up here at the top. And instead of saying this template that we specifically want to get, we take that part out. We come down here to our response, and we're going to use this, which, trust me, this is a lot easier to use. They built this in. And so now we're going to use the render function, passing the request, pass in the URL of the HTML file that we're going to use, and then you pass in your context file at the end. That saves you having an extra line up here at the top, but it also keeps it nice and neat as you're going through. All right, so if we come back and check our code, we come back to polls and we refresh. Now we have this nice lined up list of all of our different questions. Anybody got any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Again, there's lots of things that are built into Django to make things really fast to build out web applications. All right, say we don't have a particular page right now. If we go out here and we type in, say, JSON or whatever, we get this page not found. And that's not super helpful. We actually wouldn't even get this if we had debug set to false inside of our settings, which we could see what that would look like. If we come back out here to our settings file and we come down to where debug equals true. There's my debug. Static. Oh, right there at the top. All right, if we set this to false, which is what we would do in production, when we save this, should reload. Oh, for a loud host. Our load host here is going to be 127.0.0.1, and I messed that up with my numlock. 27.0.0.1. And what that's doing is just allowing our local host to come in. So when you have your debug server turned on, anybody can access your page, right? We want it to just be able to access ourselves. The idea being that if we restart, oh, it does. Wait. Right, insert a numlock on or something. Oh, I took off the other bracket. That would be that insert thing, right? Okay, so now this is up and we go to the page, we get a straight not found, right? This isn't good for our web apps or for our final projects. We cannot have just not found, right? So we want to build out our own 404 pages, and we can raise our own errors for that so that we're nice and clean. So in this case, if we go back to our views for our project, and if we scroll down beyond our vote, let's get to the very end of the vote here. There we go. And what we're going to do is take a look at the top, and from this HTTP, instead of HTTP response, we're actually going to now bring in our HTTP 404. Notice that we don't need response because we're going to do that, right? No, it's false. It's broken. Now we broke all of our other questions. We're going to end up fixing those. But for now, this is where sometimes the tutorial gets messed up. After response, go ahead and just type HTTP 404. There we go. And now under our detail, this one here, which is our response, we are going to attempt to try to pull the question that is in there. A second here, get this blown up so you can see it. And we're going to take out our original request. And in this case, we are going to try to get that same question, get that ID. If we cannot get a result back out of the database, we can raise our 404 and say that question doesn't exist and render back out our template with that given question. So what this is doing is if we actually look at our page for our question, which is like polls 1, right? You're looking at question 1. And in this case, we have a server 500 because I'm going to spell something, I'm sure. Whatever. Back in here. Go to our detail. Oh, does anybody know why this is failing with the 500?
No idea.
No idea. All right,
None.
so the reason this is failing is we're look at this detail render request. We have detail.html, right? 500 means what? Server error. And in this case, it can't find the resource, right? Is that what you're going for, Sam?
Right.
So we never created detail.html, right? If we look at our templates and our polls, there is no detail.html. So our server just crashes because it doesn't exist. So we need to go ahead and create that HTML real quick. And we're going to call this detail inside polls. Yep. And then in the body, all we're going to do is just put in our question because that's what we're passing in. And we can double check that here. Notice how we are passing in the word question and we're passing that into our template. Now, they didn't set up a context here in this example, right? If we go back to this example, we set up a context dictionary and then we just passed in the word context. In this example, they just passed in the dictionary directly. So either way is acceptable inside of there. All right, so now if we go back in our server 500 error, we refresh, we actually get the question object that comes back there. Now notice it comes back with question object 1, right? That matches what we have in our database out here. We're marking these questions by the question object number, which is just pulling the primary key out of the database. Not very useful, right? We have no clue what that question really is. So we're going to fix that here in just a second. All right. Another way that you can do a shortcut for that 404, instead of doing this try and accept, they give you a nice little function to make that nice and easy. So if we come back up to our shortcuts and after render, we could actually do get object for 404. And what that function will do is basically the same exact thing. Is it's going to try to get it. If it can't, it's going to raise an exception. You tell it what exception it wants. So in this case, we replace that code here. And all of this code gets replaced with just 2 lines. And so now we're going to do this get object or 404. We pass in what object we want, question, and we pass in the PK or the primary key for the ID that we want to pull. If nothing exists, we raise a 404. If it does exist, we go ahead and just continue to render the page. Really slick. All right. So in our template system, if we go to our detail page, and now instead of just dumping the question on the screen, we can look at a couple different things here, right? So let's do some actual HTML coding. Now, by default, when you dump the question to the screen, it's going to pull the question information and dump that, not the actual question text. So in here, we tell it as a header, give us our question text, and then we're going to do UL for every choice that's associated with that question, which we can do question. I did, yeah. This is overriding that. Now we're actually going to use it. Yes, yep. Yep. Then we're going to go through each one of the choices that are associated with that question, and we can go ahead and print that question text out on the screen in just a simple list form. Right? If we look at this function here, we're taking our question and we're taking our choice set dot all, and that's what we're going to loop through on that side. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, we partially hard coded this kind of stuff. Then we use the URL function, which is a URL template tag. So if we go back to our index HTML, oops, sorry, this one here, notice how we kind of rough built out our href inside of here. You can actually tell it to build out the URL for that. Okay. If we ended up changing a bunch of text, it would cause a bunch of issues and stuff like that. So if we look at this path in comparison, I'm just going to put it right below it. We're using the function to grab the URL for detail, and then we're going to put the question ID at the very end of that, pass in our question text. So what this does is Django will then go out to our URLs file, grab the view detail one, which is this one here, and then it's going to put that integer in on this question ID. And again, this was on our index here. So we don't have to build out and type in polls and all that. It will automatically build that out for us. Much better way to deal with it, so we're not using hard links or tags. Okay. Let's see. When we talked about URLs and namespacing, this will be the last little part that we cover here today. We just have one app called Polls in this project. In real Django, there's like tons of apps, right? It could be 5, 10, 20, depending on how many functionalities you have within your project. In our polls URL, you're going to see this in here. We want to actually set our app name. So if we go back to our URL, and we have our Django URLs path, we have from dot import our path. We want to set our app name. So app name equals polls, like that. And then we'll go ahead and keep this associated with everything that's in there. And that will also be our namespace when we pull it out on this side. So now, if we have our details, our results, and our vote, the only thing we need to change is back into our text that will point to that particular namespace. So instead of saying detail here, right, we're now going to say, go pull our polls and then the detail function. This is very similar to the way Flask was building its stuff out. So now if we go to our index and then this detail, we will say we are in the polls namespace and pull the detail function back out of there. Yep. So inside of our URLs, we just added this namespace to this particular set, which then allows us in our template system to specify what that is in here, as opposed to doing the /polls inside of there. Yes. And what that's doing is saying, go to the polls namespace, pull out the detail URL, which is this URL here. Yeah, this one here. Right, we just added polls colon in front of it. Again, the reason we're doing that is if we just let detail in, when it goes to pull URLs for our entire project, it's going to pull the first detail that it finds, right? Right now we're just dealing with our program name called polls, but if we have other apps inside of our project, it's going to mess up all the URL configs. So we want to namespace this polls. Then when we have other apps, it doesn't conflict, have issues. We specifically want the detail associated with polls. All right, and if all goes well, we should be able to still have our project. Refresh. Notice how now instead of question 1, it's pulling up what is up in a head in a H1 header. Now, there is HTML code here. If we actually look at it in inspection, we can see our HTML. Look that there is a unordered list, but nothing's in it. Anybody know why? The choices, right? We never built out any choices for this question. Therefore, there's not going to be any choices showing up here just yet. So we need to be able to build out the option in our admin to add choices so that we can set the choices. Then they would show up here on this side. And again, if we just go back to polls, it's now going to give us the list of all the different questions. So I could click on this one and it's going to set up and then display all the different choices that I want to set there. We just haven't got that far yet. Again, I know this is a ton of content to kind of go through. There's like, how many parts is total in here? Just to double check. I want to say there's a lot. So we are just about to part 4, where we actually set up forms, which is obviously what we want for the choices, right? We're going to be clicking and submitting a form. There's a total of 7 different parts in here. So we got a lot of content to cover on Tuesday. And part of that we'll probably even cover into Thursday before we start into our mini project. All right. Anybody got any questions? The last couple of ones go pretty fast because now we're just adding cool functionality to that, making it look pretty and doing all that stuff. So simple web apps, probably going to be a whole lot easier to use Flask, right? But if you remember in Flask, we had to hard code everything, where Django has these nice little helper functions to build all this stuff out for you. So whatever you decide to choose for your final project is entirely up to how big your project is, right? My recommendation would go be, depending on what your project is, probably go with Django, because that's the one you're going to see the most out in the marketplace. If you're wanting to be an advanced web developer or a Python guy and do any kind of web apps, Django is probably your best one there. If you're storing a lot of information in a database and you need all this functionality. If it's a very simple web app because you crunched a bunch of syslog files for cybersecurity majors and that kind of stuff, and you just want to display it on the screen, that's a Flask app, right? You don't need a whole database of Django in order to edit that kind of stuff. Unless you need like user permissions for who's going to see what on the filters, and you're basically building your own Splunk, then you're going to want something like Django. Mostly because they already have the admin interface. You can build everything out from there. All right, that is all I got. Make sure you save and you get and push all of your results at this point. You better if I commit and push before I go. Notice that I made multiple changes. That was a bad no. I should have committed individual pages. But we're going to say today's commit is our part 3 of tutorial. I think it's actually part 3 and 4, wasn't it? Or did we just get through part 3? Yeah, we just got through part 3. Commit push. And push. Okay. Our code is pushed up to our tutorial. All right, so part 4, again, this is just going to get us our forms and dive into that. I know I'm covering this real fast. Documentation is your friend here. If you want to add a bunch of cool, super cool documentation or functionality to your project, documentation is going to help. That's also what we're meeting for in those last 5 weeks. I'm not like, oh, now you're all Django masters, build me an awesome app. No. When you have questions during those 5 weeks, ask so I can record videos, because somebody else is going to have that question later on. Maybe this semester, maybe 4 semesters from now. All right. Stop the recording.